On the day I was set to inherit everything my late husband built, I found a bomb planted under my car. It was a gift from my ambitious daughter-in-law who saw me as just one final obstacle to a billion-dollar fortune. To the world, she was the brilliant, charming heir to our family's empire. But she smiled to my face while planning my murder, and my own son was completely under her spell. She was convinced I was just a frail old woman she could simply erase. But when my driver asked if he should call the police, I told him no. She wanted to play a game for our family's legacy, and I was about to show her how a master plays. She had no idea the public reckoning I had planned for her. For 40 years, the smell of my Greenwich mornings had been a constant, a blend of freshly cut grass, damp earth, and the crisp, clean scent of old money. It was the smell of security of a life built on order and predictability. But that morning, something was wrong. I stood by the library window, watching my driver, Arthur, begin his daily inspection of the Mercedes. He was a creature of habit, his movements precise and economical, a holdover from a past life I never asked about, but was grateful for. It was then that I saw it. Just a flicker of light where no light should be, a small, dark shape clinging to the undercarriage near the rear wheel. It was an imperfection in a world I had curated to be perfect, and a cold, quiet clarity washed over me. There was no panic, no gasp for air. Just a sudden, sharp focus, as if the world had narrowed to that single, ugly object. The final reading of my late husband Richard's will was in 2 hours. A formality, really, but one that would officially transfer control of his empire to me. An empire my ambitious daughter-in-law Victoria felt was her birthright. The timing was no coincidence. I picked up my phone, my gaze never leaving the car. My voice when I spoke to Arthur was as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. I told him there was something he needed to do, that he had to listen carefully and not react. I guided him with my words, telling him to walk to the rear passenger side wheel, to look underneath, and to confirm what I was seeing. I watched him move his gait unchanged. He knelt, making a show of checking the tire, his large frame shielding his actions from any curious eyes. A moment later, his voice came through the phone, and while it was low, I could feel the coiled fury in it. He confirmed it was a device professionally made and immediately advised me to get to a safe room while he called the police. That's where his expertise ended and mine began. I told him no. I was firm, using the tone I'd once used on corporate raiders. He was not to call anyone. He was to disable it because I knew he had the skills, and then he was to bring it to me. We were not canceling our day. We were going to a board meeting. The silence on his end was profound, but I knew he would obey. He was a man who understood a direct order. While he worked, the pieces of the puzzle assembled themselves in my mind. It was all so clear. Victoria's smile at dinner last week stretched a little too tight over her teeth. The nervous energy humming just beneath her skin, the way her eyes, usually sharp and focused, kept darting around the room. She had been almost painfully insistent on confirming my schedule, my exact departure time for the city meeting, all under the guise of loving concern. My son, her husband, saw none of it. Ricky has his father's heart, but not his eyes. He sees a brilliant, capable partner, the woman who would carry the family name into the future. I now saw a desperate animal caught in a trap of her own making, willing to chew off a limb to get free. In this case, I was the limb. A few minutes later, Arthur walked into the library. He held a small black box, its wires neatly clipped and harmless. He placed it squarely in the center of my late husband's mahogany desk, a piece of crude violence sitting atop a monument of civilized success. He told me the timer had been set for 10:45 a.m., which would have put us right in the middle of the Triborough Bridge. The word catastrophic hung in the air between us. I looked at the device. It was an instrument of sheer terror, but it wasn't the work of a professional killer. It was sloppy, desperate. It was Victoria's final, frantic gamble to save herself from whatever mess she was in. She had gotten careless, and in doing so, she had lost the war before it had even truly begun. The shock that should have consumed me was replaced by a cold, rising anger. She wanted to fight for Richard's legacy fine. She had fired her shot, and she had missed. And in her failure, she had handed me the perfect weapon. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the numbers for the police for only a second before I scrolled to her name. When I called my daughter-in-law, my voice was a perfect imitation of a frail, panicked old woman. I told her something dreadful had happened, that Arthur had found a terrifying thing under the car, and that I was simply beside myself with fear. I added, be a few minutes late for the meeting. Listening to her flawless performance of shock and concern, I felt a grim satisfaction settle over me. The game was on, but it wouldn't be fought with bombs and timers. It would be a quiet, elegant war waged with whispers and truths, ending with the slow, public dismantling of her entire life. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. On the other end of the phone, Victoria's performance was truly something to behold. She produced a flawless symphony of panic and relief, insisting that my safety was the only thing that mattered. She said we should forget the meeting, cancel everything, that she would come right over. It was expertly done, calibrated to sound like the perfect, loving daughter-in-law. While she spoke, I sat at my desk, the inert bomb sitting beside me like a silent, brutal paperweight. I let a tremor creep into my own voice, telling her it was nonsense, that Richard would have wanted us to proceed. Business above all, I reminded her, a motto our family lived by. Then I set the hook. I told her that Arthur said the device looked almost commercial, as if it were purchased. I mentioned that he'd noted some offshore components. I paused, feigning the confusion of an old woman out of her depth, and asked her, as the financial wizard of the family, if that suggested anything to her. What kind of person, I wondered aloud, has access to things like that? The silence that followed was so complete, I could practically hear her mind racing. That single, simple question was a bullet I'd aimed at the hidden, rotting part of her life. To a common criminal, offshore might be a manufacturing detail, but to a woman like Victoria, I suspected it was a trigger word for a very specific kind of secret. Her seamless performance shattered. She stammered, claiming she had no idea, that she wouldn't know the first thing about it. Then the lie came clumsy and desperate. It must be corporate espionage, she said, one of our rivals trying to destabilize the company. I let the lie hang in the air between us, simply saying that it was an interesting theory and that we would have to be extra careful. By the time Arthur drove me into Manhattan, the city that had been my husband's kingdom, Victoria was a wreck. When I stepped into the gleaming office lobby, the mask of the calm, competent executive she wore so well was slipping badly. She fussed over me, her hands trembling so much that water sloshed over the rim of the glass she poured for me. My son Ricky stood beside her, his face etched with pure, bewildered concern for his mother. He asked if I was sure I was up for this. I patted his hand and told him I was more than up for it, but my eyes were locked on Victoria. The meeting began, and for 20 minutes I let the estate lawyer drone on about share distributions and legal clauses. Then I made my move. I discreetly slid my phone across the vast mahogany table to my son. He looked at me confused, then down at the screen. I had opened a single high-resolution photo of the bomb, its ugly wires and timer clearly visible, sitting on my desk at home. Beneath it, I'd typed a simple message. I told him that Arthur was ex-Special Forces and had identified the timer as a specific model favored by certain Eastern European private debt collectors. I asked if that meant anything to him, and then the final sharp twist of the knife. "Ask your wife." Ricky froze. His eyes darted from the phone to my face, and for the first time, he saw the genuine calculated terror I was projecting. Then he looked at his wife. He saw the flicker of sheer animal panic that erased her carefully constructed facade. He didn't ask the question. He didn't need to. Victoria had followed his gaze and seen the photo on the screen. The blood drained from her face. I knew in that instant she wasn't just seeing a bomb. She was seeing the face of the man who gave it to her. Her composure completely shattered. She muttered a flimsy excuse and practically fled the boardroom. I watched her go, feeling a cold, grim satisfaction. The first crack in the dam had appeared. Of course, the meeting was concluded shortly after. Ricky, flustered and confused, insisted we postpone. In the quiet sanctuary of the Mercedes on the ride back to Greenwich, I made a call. It was to David, my oldest and dearest friend, a retired investigative journalist with a mind like a steel trap. I told him I was sending him a package and that a very interesting story was about to break. I needed him to be the one to write it. My first ally was now in place. The game was escalating. I finally understood that Victoria wasn't just being greedy. She was being hunted. And a hunted animal is the most dangerous kind of all. The most effective move in any conflict is the one your opponent misinterprets as weakness. For the next week, I performed the part of a terrified, fragile widow with absolute precision. I had Arthur formally cancel all my public appearances, and I informed my son that the shock of the incident had been too much for me. I told him, checking into an exclusive wellness retreat in the Berkshires to recover. To Ricky, and especially to Victoria, this was a white flag. They saw a frail old woman crumbling under pressure, retreating from the world. It was exactly what I wanted them to see. They believed they had dodged a bullet, that my probing questions at the meeting were nothing more than the paranoid ramblings of a traumatized victim. A thick, comforting fog of false security settled over them. Victoria's arrogance bloomed in that fog. A few days into my retreat, a ridiculously large bouquet of white lilies arrived. Lilies, the flower of funerals. The card tucked inside was short and cloying, telling me to rest and recover, and that they would handle everything. It was a staggering miscalculation. She saw me as a problem that was now neatly contained, completely underestimating the woman she had tried to kill. She had no idea that while she was arranging flowers, I was arranging a war. My suite at the wellness retreat was less about meditation and more about mobilization. It was a state-of-the-art war room. Arthur had swept it for bugs and stood guard outside, ensuring absolute privacy. Inside, surrounded by encrypted laptops and a series of untraceable burner phones, my old friend David and I got to work. We weren't investigating the bomb that was the end of the story, not the beginning. We were investigating Victoria. We started a deep dive into her life, peeling back the layers of her perfect public persona. For days, we hit nothing but dead ends. Her official finances were pristine, her investments sound. But my husband taught me that the real story is never in the official books. Using the knowledge I'd gained from decades of sitting on the boards of international charities, I guided David through the labyrinth of offshore banking and shell corporations, a shadowy world where fortunes are hidden. He was the investigator, but I was the guide who knew the terrain. And then he found it. A single thread in a tapestry of lies. A wire transfer for an astonishing amount sent from one of Victoria's minor personal accounts, an account she likely thought was too small to notice, to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The name on the account was Anton Volkov. The name meant nothing to me, but to David. It was like a flare in the darkness. He spent the next few hours digging his face, growing grimmer with each click of the keyboard. What he uncovered was the whole sordid story. Anton Volkov was not a legitimate financier. He was a known associate of a notoriously violent Eastern European crime syndicate specializing in high-level money laundering. 6 months earlier, he had sold Victoria on a guaranteed offshore investment, a secret fund that he promised would triple her money in 90 days. She wasn't just trying to get rich. She was trying to prove she could outperform my husband's legacy. She took the bait. David then managed, through a source I didn't ask about, to get a glimpse into their communications. The picture became terrifyingly clear. The fund was a complete fabrication, a scam to get her on the hook. And once they had her, they started to squeeze. We saw the final message she'd received just before the board meeting, a dark, encrypted photo of her own front door timestamped that morning. The text beneath it was simple and brutal. It said the clock was ticking, that they would collect their return one way or another. The bomb, we realized, wasn't even her idea. It was a tool they provided when she confessed the inheritance was tied up. Her life and the lives of my son and grandchildren were the collateral. David's voice was heavy with shock when he spoke to me over our encrypted line. He told me she wasn't just trying to get rich. She was trying to climb out of a grave she'd dug for herself. I felt a chill run down my spine, but it was a chill of cold, hard steel. I told him it was worse than that. She was willing to put me in that grave to save herself. A new clarity settled over me. Victoria was a symptom, but this Anton Volkov was the disease. My focus shifted. I told David our next move. We were going to find Mr. Volkov. It was time I said that he truly understood who his business partner was and who she had tried to remove from the board. While Victoria grew careless in her relief, I was secretly assembling the evidence that would not just expose her crime, but unravel the entire criminal enterprise that held her in its grip. After a week of silence, I agreed to reconvene the inheritance meeting. I chose the family estate in Greenwich as the location, a concession designed to make Victoria feel secure. She believed it was her territory, a setting she could control. When I arrived, she was the picture of composure, the concerned daughter-in-law carefully managing a difficult family crisis. My son and a few other relatives, the ones who had been whispering in his ear for months, were there as well. They saw me settle into an armchair by the fireplace, a frail old woman, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, and their shoulders relaxed. They thought the storm had passed. The illusion was shattered at precisely 3 o'clock, the moment Arthur opened the grand front door to admit the final guest. It wasn't one of the estate lawyers or a board member. It was David, my old friend, looking sharp and serious. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 stone-faced men in dark, impeccably tailored suits that did nothing to hide their broad shoulders. They radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable federal authority. David smiled politely at the stunned faces in the room, his eyes landing on Victoria. He introduced himself, his voice pleasant but firm, and explained that he was there at my invitation. Then he gestured to the men beside him. They were, he said, from the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They had some questions for her about a Mr. Anton Volkov. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Victoria's carefully constructed facade of control and competence didn't just crack. It dissolved into dust. In its place was a raw, primal fear. My son Ricky stared in utter confusion, looking from the strange men to his wife, then to me. He asked what was going on, his voice trembling slightly. That was my cue. I rose from the armchair, letting the cashmere shawl fall away. I was no longer frail, no longer the victim. I stood tall, the matriarch of the house, and I felt the power in the room shift, bending toward me. I told Richard it was time for the truth. Then I looked directly at Victoria, whose face had gone ashen. It was time, I said, for his wife to tell him everything. And she did. The sight of the federal agents, the utter certainty in my eyes, it broke her. The confession wasn't a neat, orderly admission. It was a dam of lies bursting apart, a torrent of sobs and desperate, tangled justifications. She confessed everything. The scam she'd fallen for, the tens of millions in family funds she'd lost, the threats. She told my son how the criminals were threatening not just her, but him and their children. And then came the final ugly truth. The bomb wasn't her idea. It was a tool Volkov had given her, a final solution, when she couldn't liquidate the estate funds fast enough to pay him. Her confession created a seismic shockwave in the room. I watched my son stare at his wife, the woman he loved, as if she were a complete stranger. In that moment, he no longer saw a partner. He saw a desperate gambler who had bet their entire lives and lost catastrophically. The other family members, the ones who had been so sympathetic to Victoria's modernizing influence, recoiled in horror. Their quiet little conspiracy to sideline the old woman fractured, instantly devolving into panicked finger-pointing and frantic denials. I let the raw, ugly truth hang in the air, forcing them all to breathe it in, to stew in the poison of Victoria's choices. I was no longer the victim. I was the commander, the strategist who had seen the entire battlefield while they had only seen their own petty ambitions. Finally, when the chaos had reached its peak, I spoke, my voice cutting through the noise. I explained that the Treasury agents were there for Mr. Volkov. They were willing to offer Victoria a deal in exchange for her full cooperation in dismantling his entire network. I let the weight of that offer settle in a chance at a life raft, but one that came at a very high price. I made it clear, however, that their business was with the federal government. Our business was with each other. I looked around the room at the shocked and shamed faces of my family. I told them the meeting was adjourned. It would be reconvened in 1 week in the main boardroom of the New York office. They would all be there. And we, I finished, would decide the future of this family. My way. They were left powerless, stripped of their secrets, terrified not just of the law, but of the public reckoning that was now inevitably to come. The week leading up to the final meeting was the quietest I had ever known. It was the silence of a held breath of a world waiting for a verdict. When the day came, the boardroom on the 50th floor felt less like an office and more like a glass-walled cage suspended high above Manhattan. It was a fitting arena for the final act. The long mahogany table was filled with the key players, our most trusted estate lawyers, the senior board members, whose faces were etched with grim understanding, and the fractured, silent members of my family. My son, Richard Jr., sat beside his wife, but he wasn't there as a husband. His face was impassive, his posture rigid. He was her warden. Victoria was a ghost. The vibrant, ambitious charisma that had defined her was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed terror. The designer suit that once broadcast her power now hung off her diminished frame. I entered last. I didn't stride in with the dramatic flair of a victor, but with the quiet, unshakable authority of a queen calmly retaking her throne. I ignored the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat of power my husband had once occupied. Instead, I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, letting the iconic city skyline serve as my backdrop. When I spoke, my voice was calm and measured, amplified by the room's impeccable acoustics. I thanked them all for coming and stated that we were there to finalize the transfer of Richard's estate. But before that, I added there were some housekeeping items to address. I began systematically, not with wild accusations, but with cold, hard facts. My friend David, sitting discreetly to the side, had prepared a presentation. On the room's main monitor, a timeline of Victoria's secret financial dealings appeared. I narrated the story it told, presenting copies of documents, flight manifests, and wire transfer receipts. Each click of the remote was another nail in the coffin of her reputation. I explained that Victoria's ambition for the company was well known and in many ways admirable. What was not known, I continued, my voice devoid of malice, was the depth of her desperation. A desperation born from a catastrophic financial error that had led her into business with violent criminals. Then I projected the final image. It was the high-resolution photograph of the bomb sitting on my mahogany desk. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The board members, men and women, who thought in terms of billions of dollars and hostile takeovers, stared in horror at the crude, lethal reality of the device. I let the image hang there for a long moment before speaking. I simply stated that the device had been placed under my car and that it had been provided to Victoria by her creditors as a means of expediting her inheritance. The judgment, when it came, was not from me. It came from the room itself. It was in the way the board members stared at Victoria, their shock curdling into utter revulsion. It was in the way her former allies in the family refused to meet her gaze, studying their hands or the wood grain of the table with intense focus. That silent collective condemnation was a more profound punishment than any prison sentence. This was the true reckoning, the public annihilation of the competent, respected, brilliant identity she had so carefully constructed. She finally broke. Her voice was a cracked whisper that barely carried across the table. She said she was scared. She explained that he, Volkov, was going to hurt her children, hurt Ricky. She said she never wanted to hurt me, that she just didn't know what else to do. Her tears were real. Her desperation had been real. But so had her choices. I let her confession hang in the air, a final, pathetic truth, in a room full of lies. Then I delivered the consequences. I made it clear that her cooperation with the federal authorities would determine her legal fate, and that was out of my hands. Her fate with this family, however, and with this company, was not. I turned to the lawyers and issued my orders. The succession plan was to be rewritten immediately. Victoria's considerable shares would be placed into a blind trust for her children, a trust she would have no access to or control over ever. She was to be removed from the board and all positions within the company effective immediately. She would sign a binding permanent non-disclosure agreement. In return for her signature, and only in return, the family would quietly pay the restitution required to cover the initial funds she had misappropriated. We, I said, would handle the criminals. She would handle the consequences of her choices. It was not cruel. It was just. It was the surgical removal of a cancer, a painful but necessary procedure designed to save the whole. In that moment, I had not just reclaimed my inheritance. I had protected my husband's legacy from the inside out. I had taken a violent, ugly betrayal and turned it into a moment of absolute, undeniable strength. The victory wasn't in the revenge, but in the quiet, final restoration of order and honor. The aftermath wasn't a loud explosion, but a quiet earthquake that permanently reshaped the landscape of our lives. The tremors of that day in the boardroom radiated outward silently, altering every relationship and every future. For Victoria, the sentence I delivered was only the beginning. Her legal fate was tied to the federal case, and she took the deal offered. To save herself from prison, she became their star witness, her encyclopedic knowledge of Anton Volkov's financial dealings proving to be her only remaining asset. But her true sentence was a social and professional one. The doors of high society and high finance, the worlds she had fought so desperately to conquer, were permanently sealed to her. She became a pariah, a ghost in Greenwich. I would hear whispers about her at charity luncheons, a cautionary tale for ambitious wives. She was seen, but never spoken to, a living embodiment of a catastrophic fall from grace. My family, what was left of it, took different paths. The cousins and in-laws who had once allied with Victoria, hoping to ride her coattails to greater influence, simply retreated into silence. Their opinions no longer carried weight. Their presence at family gatherings became muted, their influence forever diminished. My son Ricky bore the heaviest burden. He was consumed by a toxic cocktail of guilt for his blindness, shame for his wife's actions, and a deep, complicated love for the woman he thought he knew, a love he couldn't simply extinguish. His journey was the most arduous. He began the slow, painful process of therapy, not to excuse his wife, but to hold himself accountable for his own willful ignorance. He sought to understand how the foundation of his life could have been built on such a profound lie, and whether anything could be rebuilt from the ashes. As for me, I thrived. I didn't just resume my position as the matriarch or the head of the company, I redefined it. I took the helm not as a placeholder keeping my husband's seat warm, but as a visionary in my own right. My calm, strategic mind, once dismissed as outdated, proved more effective and innovative than Victoria's aggressive ambition ever was. My most important act was establishing a new philanthropic arm of our foundation, one dedicated entirely to supporting victims of sophisticated financial fraud. It was a quiet, powerful acknowledgement of the crisis that had nearly claimed my life, a way to turn my personal pain into public purpose. I reconnected with my community no longer as a reclusive widow, but as a formidable leader. My home, once a silent monument to the past, was once again filled with life and laughter, but this time it was entirely on my own terms. 6 months after the reckoning, I was in the company boardroom, the same glass-walled cage suspended over Manhattan. But the atmosphere was transformed. There was no tension, no judgment. I was mentoring a group of brilliant young female entrepreneurs, my new passion project. I was laughing my eyes bright with a purpose that felt new and exhilarating when Arthur entered silently and handed me a tablet. On the screen was a news alert from a major financial journal. The headline read, "International Financial Crime Ring Dismantled Thanks to Key Witness." Below it was a grainy, long-lens photo of Victoria leaving a federal courthouse, her face obscured by a dark scarf, hurrying into the back of a black car. I looked at the photo for a long moment, my expression unreadable. I felt no triumph, no flush of victory, no gloating satisfaction. There was only a quiet, profound sense of peace. I had faced the darkest parts of my own family and had not only survived, but had transformed that pain into wisdom. I had protected my husband's legacy not for myself, but for the future generations represented by the very women sitting in front of me. I closed the tablet and set it down on the table. I turned back to the young women who were watching me with curiosity. I smiled, picked up my sentence exactly where I had left off, my voice strong and clear, the very picture of resilience. The consequences Victoria faced were part of a lasting reality she had created for herself. The new reality I had built was one of strength, freedom, and a calculated kindness to the future. In the end, Hannah's story teaches a powerful lesson about the nature of justice. It shows that the most profound victory isn't found in fiery revenge, but in a calm, calculated restoration of order. She understood that her daughter-in-law was not a monster, but a desperate person who made monstrous choices. True strength, she demonstrated, is the wisdom to see the fear behind the betrayal and to deliver consequences that are not only powerful, but also just. It is a reminder that protecting one's legacy and peace is the ultimate form of winning.